listeners may know of Terrence Malick. Probably, if you haven't heard of, if you're just a Catholic listening and you haven't heard of him, you may have heard of the film A Hidden Life, which came out a few years ago. But you may well have also heard of The Tree of Life or The Thin Red Line.
Yeah, there's a few things to know about Malick that are important biographically, and then kind of more to deal with kind of how he approaches filmmaking. He comes from from what I understand to be a fairly wealthy Texas oil background. He went to Harvard, graduated, I believe, at the top of his class in the mid 1960s. He went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship to study philosophy. And then he had a falling out with his advisor and ended up leaving Oxford before finishing his graduate degree, at which point he started to work as a journalist freelance. He taught philosophy at MIT for a bit, and this is in the late 1960s. And then around, I believe around 1969 or so, he decides, you know what, I'm going to go to Hollywood. I'm going to try making movies. And he enrolls in the American Film Institute, which was a newer film school starting at the time, and is very much catching the wave of kind of the influence of a lot of international cinema coming into the United States, the influence of the French New Wave, all these kind of various new kind of organic things happening in Hollywood. The American Film Institute is kind of capturing people who are wanting to be at the forefront of making cinema, revitalizing cinema in Hollywood. And so Malick ends up in the same kind of class basically as people like Paul Schrader. There are other names as well that I'm forgetting at the moment, but kind of a who's who of early new Hollywood filmmakers and production people, and just all these important figures. He starts working as a screenwriter. Apparently, I'm not sure how verified this is. I've seen sort of multiple people talking about it. Apparently, he worked on an early draft of Dirty Harry, which is quite interesting when you look at his later films. Eventually he decided to get into directing himself. So maybe what's the important thing about that kind of trajectory is he's someone who does not his background is not one that sort of tends towards filmmaking as an obvious thing. He's coming from a very intellectual background. He was going into philosophy. He
translated a book by Heidegger, right?
He translated a book by Heidegger while
came out like 69.
While a student, yeah. But he was on a trajectory to be a philosopher, and then something happened again while he was at Oxford in the mid to late 1960s. He had a disagreement with his advisor, who was, I believe, coming from I think it's the analytical school. I'm not 100% sure about the exact terminology for the philosophical schools there, but they had a disagreement over Malick's thesis, and that led to him leaving and not completing his degree. But what's interesting to know, why is it important to kind of know that? It's when people start to encounter his films, typically a few things happen. There's often a sense of puzzlement. There might be a sense of wonder. His films don't go down smoothly like commercial mainstream films, like most people tend to expect them to, even though he makes films that are with big Hollywood stars. They're with famous actors. They're very beautifully shot. They're very colorful. They're visually stunning films. There's a lot of things that draw people in, but then you kind of have this often though. I think for everyone who comes to Malick as a new viewer, there will be some kind of encounter where you start to wonder, why is he doing that? Why is that happening? And that could be something as simple as a scene that doesn't quite make sense as a story thing, or it could be a moment that seems to be too extended. At a certain point, a Malick film will kind of challenge you with something more than what you thought you were going to get, if that makes sense. And then the question kind of becomes, what do you do with that? But I think if people who are coming to him for the first time understand, he's coming from this philosophy background, which isn't to say that he's trying to do philosophy through cinema. I think you could make an argument that that's something that he ends up doing and does try to do. And perhaps earlier on in his career, he's trying to do that more. But that he's coming from a place of contemplating the world. He's coming from a background where he is very interested in kind of the what's beneath the surfaces of things. And you can see this as we'll get into with Badlands and Days of Heaven. You can see this dynamic is there right from the start.
Right.
Maybe the other thing I'll just mention as a way of introduction is that, so it's very well known that, again, Malick, coming from this sort of philosophical contemplative background, he makes films that are seen as very philosophical contemplative. What's probably more controversial, and it certainly is kind of a surprising development, certainly in the last 20 years, is that, or sorry, there's two things. So Malick very famously, after he made his two 1970s films, Badlands and Days of Heaven, he disappeared. And so he basically kind of lived in Europe for a number of years, and he did not complete another film until the late 1990s, when he shot and released The Thin Red Line. And this was a major comeback moment. The reason why he left Hollywood is kind of shrouded in mystery. There's a lot of speculation, but he came back, and he came back with a vengeance. He started making more feature films. The next film he made after Thin Red Line was in 2005 with The New World, a film about the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. And then from that point, he starts to get way more productive. The Tree of Life came out 12 years ago. In that time, he released 4 more feature narrative films and at least one other documentary kind of film on top of that. So he's only sped up as he's gotten older. But what's interesting is that the critical consensus around his work has changed kind of drastically in the last 10 years, to the point where before he was this sort of odd figure for a lot of people, and he still is. But after he finished The Tree of Life, there was a cooling in the critical community, the film criticism world, around his work for various reasons. And, exploring the series, I'm sure we'll get into it with each film. But I just say this as a way of saying there's a trajectory. So he has this he bursts onto the scene in the 1970s. He's coming from this very kind of eclectic background. He's an extremely intelligent, fresh voice. He makes these 2 films that blow everybody away. Then he disappears. Then he comes back 20 years later, makes more films that blow people away, culminating with The Tree of Life, which, wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes and is nominated for Oscars and all that. And then he just kind of, the arc kind of goes down, at least in terms of critical perception, public perception. And so now we're in this place now where Terrence Malick is, he's a beloved figure. He's obviously a master of cinema, but the question of what is he about? What is his work about? What is he, what is good and maybe not so good about his work is a really live question right now, that it's like the perfect time basically to jump into this and really wrestle with what he's doing.
And what about his religious background, Nathan?
Yeah, absolutely. So the other thing that's important to realize about Malick is that religiously we don't know a whole lot about his religious beliefs, but it is
He's extremely private.
He's an extremely private individual. It's very clear by this point that he is a believing Christian of some sort. I'm pretty sure he's an Episcopalian. Some of his biographical sources out there have pointed to that. But it also seems pretty clear that he's had some sort of journey, towards a deeper understanding of the Christian faith through his life. It's not so much visible, in his earlier films, but once you kind of get into the 2000s, especially with The Tree of Life and a film he made right after The Tree of Life called To the Wonder, these are the two extremely explicitly Christian themed and in their mode. Like they're films that are kind of operating almost like prayers. They're operating as these contemplative experiences of what it means to be a person in relationship with God, and not just in sort of a general sense, not just in like kind of like a God of the philosopher sense. Like there is a very The Tree of Life opens, with a quotation from the Book of Job. So he's deeply interested in the meaning of not just what it means to be human, but to be a human being who is a creature, who is a child of God. And he also is he's interested in exploring that in purely, or he's interested in exploring that through the artistic path. It's not so much a logical path or a moral path, I guess you could say. These are all tied up, of course, in the films, but he's really reaching for the ways that cinema as a medium can capture this experience of what it means to be a person, which includes the religious dimension as well. So I hold him as, I'll put my cards on the table. I think he's the most important filmmaker alive right now. I think for me, he's the most personally inspiring. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's not only because he's a Christian making films. But there's so much that he has to offer to viewers, to artists, to everybody who wants to jump into how film can capture the meaning of man's relationship to God, if that makes sense.
I think that Malick really earns the name or the title of auteur. And there's something interesting about him too, in that his films are sort of equal parts like Hollywood blockbuster and auteur indie cinema. That they attract these A-list stars, and he's perhaps maybe the only director who can have real AAA actors struggling to get in his film, and then he'll cut them out entirely afterward, and nobody will complain because they want to be in the next one.
But people still seek him out.
Yes, and I think that if the critical perception of him has cooled over the years, I don't think that's the case within the world of actors. I think actors still desperately want to be in a Malick film. I think it's partly because of his reputation as an actor's director. Something that I'll add with his being a philosopher is that I think that you could say that there's something phenomenological about his work. I think it's appropriate that he's a student of Heidegger. St. John Paul II was too, not literally a student of Heidegger, but interested in phenomenology. I think that from the beginning you can see this kind of a bent that we might describe also as poetic or lyrical, where things are happening that are meant to sort of suggest something in this poetic or graphical way that isn't necessarily meant to be unlocked intellectually or decoded. He's not well, how do I put this? He's this philosophical filmmaker who is not like weaving intellectual arguments into his work in a way that needs to be sort of parsed and decoded. Yeah. It's something that really is cinematic. It really is experiential. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with phenomenological.
Yeah, maybe intuitive would be another way of putting it. I think
things
just kind of
absolutely
flow. So.
And not only that, this is a Protestant, but he is a very educated man. He's read St. Augustine. He's drawing on Catholic literary sources, even aside from the Bible.
Yeah.
The Imitation of Christ, St. Augustine's Confessions, things like
totally.
that. So that's in the DNA of his films just as much as Scripture is.
Yeah.
And perhaps one other thing I just want to add to that, I'm glad we're kind of digging into this for a second, is that it's really important to make the distinction of why is someone like him maybe more worthwhile studying than other filmmakers who deal with religious subject matter. And the thing is that, like with Malick, he is clearly coming from a place of sincerity, of not only respect for people's belief, but that again, I don't know Malick, but it seems to me pretty clear that he is a man of faith himself, because of the level of sincerity, the level of detail, the level of understanding of the spiritual life. These are all things that have come through particularly his films from The Tree of Life onwards. You can see it in traces in earlier films as well. But particularly in the ones he's made in the last 10, 15 years, there is such a depth of understanding of what it means to be a person who is searching for God that you don't find. And I apologize to my viewers. I apologize to the viewers who might be a bit scandalized by me saying this, that you don't find with someone like Martin Scorsese, even when Martin Scorsese is also in a full quest mode with a film like Silence.
Right.
It's the sense that at least I get from Scorsese's quest films is that he's looking from the outside, and as the sincerity of that, I think there is a sincerity there, but there isn't maybe necessarily the something is. I don't want to just like,
sure.
you know,
I think I know what you're talking about.
There's
somehow a failure to launch, or like a failure to take like the next step. Like it's like there's something being held back.
Yeah, I think maybe it has to do with being held back, or maybe even the question of like good faith, you know, whether someone's operating in good faith or not, or with all the tools that God is offering someone to work with. But to me, it's clear that Malick is operating as someone of faith. He is someone who I think is fully in the search for God. You know,
and also more than that, I think it's because you find in his works a positive proposition of the value of forgiveness, of hope, of the reality of love. You know, so it's not just the quest, that there is within there the finding as well. If not in a totally conclusive way, there is a receptivity to what the answer might be. Which is, I think, somewhere where a filmmaker like Scorsese might miss the mark in some places, you know?
Yes, that's exactly it. Hope, and kind of like hope and love are really the two best ways to summarize Malick.